So, Heather, we are now, I think, in the officially outside of the wake in many respects, at least in the sort of the political news cycle respects of the Kavanaugh hearings, and yet the Republicans have been able, and it's fascinating to me, because again, we said this in the first segment. We should say it again. We should say it. The next 3 or 4 times I think that we talked before, maybe less actually now, two times that we talk before the elections, that the midterms loom large in all of these things. And we're going to talk about it in the context of the Mueller investigation. We're going to be talking about it in the context of things like cuts to Social Security and Medicare. We're going to be talking about it in the context of both from foreign policy and the potential for a conflict with Iran. And I think this week also brought about 2 phenomena. I mean, one, the Republicans seem to be able to elongate their part of the Kavanaugh fight, I guess, which is to talk about the left-wing mob that exists now. And of course, what they're talking about are protesters who are protesting not only the decisions that Kavanaugh will ultimately make on the Supreme Court about a woman's right to choose, about questions of healthcare and rights for disabilities, and the disenfranchisement of hundreds of thousands of people in terms of their ability to vote, and corporate power and the ability of government to regulate corporations and polluters and whatnot, but also the question of sexual assault and the question of accountability and the question of, the privilege that white men in the society, and particularly some from the elite, have and expect. And the Republicans have maintained this notion of an angry mob. Simultaneously, we see at the beginning of the week a naked display of all we could call it is like fascist thuggery by a self-professed violent gang that perceives themselves as the tip of the spear for the conservative movement. They were aided and embedded by Republican elected official staffers in a Republican metropolitan club in a Tony part of New York City. And these 2 things stand in stark contrast this week. And again, a perfect example, if Republicans retain control of the House, these fascist types, these so-called Proud Boys, this gang, types like this are going to be even more emboldened because it's going to be a referendum in favor of Donald Trump and the Republicans.
Well, right. I mean, first of all, let's, unpack this a little bit. This angry mob in the post-Kavanaugh period here, which, Mitch McConnell came out and talked about how they've stormed the halls of Congress and it was so threatening to them. I mean, let's not forget what we're talking about are rape survivors who came to Washington and they cornered senators in the hallway and in elevators to tell them their stories and beg them not to vote for Brett Kavanaugh. I mean, apparently these men found that very threatening. And the truth is, of course, they didn't.
They're lying,
yeah,
right?
They didn't.
Of course, right?
They didn't, and they knew that this was not, in any way physically intimidating. The protests were nothing compared to the protests in the town halls in 2010 over Obamacare. And in fact, I put up some video on one of my pieces in Salon last week that showed, you remember they spit on Democratic Congressman
Right.
Emanuel Cleaver and screamed in John Lewis's face as they were trying to walk across the grounds. I mean, it was intense and really had a very violent feeling about it. No, they were not physically intimidated. And my personal feeling is that they that this was actually an elaborate troll on the part of the Republican senators. First of all, to try and get past their, their kind of shame over the Kavanaugh business, but also to try and intimidate Democratic lawmakers into distancing themselves from their passionate supporters. I mean, this idea that, and the media jumped right on it too. Oh, look, the violent mob, there's mob action, and oh, they're going up to people in restaurants, and that's just terrible, and look how out of control and uncivil they all are, calling for civility. That's just a method to try and get Democrats to disown or condemn their own supporters. And so far, I haven't seen much evidence that Democrats are doing that, which is somewhat surprising.
Right.
I mean, normally they would. I mean, that's usually a pretty effective ploy on the part of the Republicans. And yeah, it does fire up their base. But that has been, this has been not, this idea of this angry mob actually goes back to the moment when Donald Trump was inaugurated. And the NRA immediately came out of the box with this campaign called the righteous fist of truth, I think it's called. The clenched fist of truth, sorry. And it was run by Dana Loesch. And what it was this idea that Antifa and the resistance were all the same thing, and they were marauding in the streets and getting ready to burn down your town. And they put out a whole series of those ads, and they've been pimping that from the very beginning. I mean, that's been going on for 2 years. So this idea that there is this angry mob is sort of churning underneath, and that leads us to these groups like the Proud Boys. They're positioning themselves as the defense against the left-wing angry mob, right? I mean, that is how that's being sold in right-wing circles, that these guys are protecting themselves. And the scariest part of that Proud Boys incident is the fact that the cops seem to be on the Proud Boys' side.
Right.
Because there were Antifa outside the event, and they were holding signs and screaming at them and what have you. They didn't start the violence. But that was sort of how the cops perceived it, that they were provoking the Proud Boys, and they kind of, I mean, if you saw the videos, you could see that they were not exactly aggressive in stopping the beatings that were taking place. So I think that that's sort of where that part of it is leading, and part of pimping this idea of the violent left-wing mob, mostly a bunch of women wearing pink hats, is to sort of give them the excuse in case this does sort of escalate. And I see it escalating with or without Trump's, without winning the midterms or without, anything. This is something that's happening sort of organically on the right, and it's really, really dangerous. I mean, you see those red hats on cops, and you see those red hats on those Proud Boys, and you're kind of going, ooh, this is not. There are some historical parallels that are disturbing, to say the least.
And we should say it was a U.S. congressman's staffer who set this event up at the Republican Metropolitan Club.
Right.
Right. I mean, so this is not at arm's length. I mean, the idea of a Democratic congressperson setting up a black bloc, a group of people use black bloc tactics to speak at a Democratic club is unlikely, to say the least. And the outrage would be enormous. I think there's a misconception amongst people as to who so-called Antifa people are, right? This is people who are simply fighting against fascists, to be distinguished from, black bloc, people who use black bloc tactics. But I think that, in the popular conception, these are the same things. But neither group, and Antifa can be just a teacher who is, trying to identify, one of these guys who are involved in beating somebody at Charlottesville through the internet. None of these people would ever be invited to a Democratic function in their official capacity. It's just absurd, right? But yet we see this where the Republicans are hosting this guy Gavin McInnes to do a reproduction of the assassination of a Japanese socialist figure from the 1950s. I mean, this is, clearly the Republicans are trying to be, provoke some type of violent conflict.
Yeah.
All right, but we got to take a break. Let's talk more about this on the other side. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio. I'm talking to the great Heather Parton, or Digby.